Of course, these days, helicopters are used for everything, from putting up power lines to stringing towers for ski hills to search and rescue and surveying. But the work they do now is possible because of the work that was done back in the late 40s. 3 men from the Okanagan created Okanagan helicopters, learned how to fly them, and of course, the rest is history. Tonight on Okanagan Pioneers and Places, the story of Okanagan helicopters is told by Peter Corley Smith. Welcome to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with my storyteller today, Peter Corley Smith, who's told a lot of stories in his day, and we've got a couple of his books here. Helicopters, the British Columbia Story. His latest book, Pilots to Presidents, British Columbia Aviation Pioneers and Leaders. The thing about Peter Corley Smith is that he flew special operations flights in the Second World War over Europe, dropping spies, and then found himself in the aviation business in Canada around Ottawa in the early 50s, flying helicopters. So the story we tell tonight must be very close to your heart, Peter. Helicopters is an important aspect of your life.
Well, it was an exciting thing. At my age, I was about 30 years old and sort of beginning to feel a bit over the hill. And I started a brand new career flying helicopters. I'd been mining before then in Africa. And it was exciting. And of course, it was new then. In 1954, helicopters had only been flying in Canada for 5 years. And it was great fun to be a part of something new. And I thought then I was going to end up within a few years being president of the company, but it didn't happen that way.
And the interesting thing, and the reason we've asked Peter to come here, is because the story is about where the first 5 years of helicopter training came in, and that was right here in the Okanagan. But there's something about the fascination of flying, and seeing as I have an aviation writer with me here, I have this picture in my mind of a fixed-wing aircraft held that looks like gossamer and cloth, flying over the Kelowna Regatta sometime around 1904. What was that? Can you tell me what that was?
Later than 1904. I think it was in 1912 or 1913. You've caught me because I haven't got my own book here to check it. But his name was Edwards, and I don't know what his first name was. And he gave two or three exhibitions in the valley that year. And unfortunately, he was killed about 3 or 4 weeks later, apparently because of his slackness in maintenance. He had spliced a spar that was damaged and done it very crudely, and it was a windy day, and he was flying over an orchard, and the wing collapsed, and he was killed. That's about all I knew about him. I didn't follow it any further.
An anecdote.
Yeah.
And the first flights in the Okanagan would be of this kind of plane dating back to about those years, 1912.
1912 was the exact date, the first flight in the Okanagan, and that was Billy Stark. And he was the son of what is it? I think he was an automobile salesman by then. They started with bicycles like the Wright brothers, then went to motorbikes, and then went to automobiles. And his father was doing well. He brought the first car out into Vancouver, apparently in 1903 or 1904. And Billy decided he wanted to be a pilot. And he went down and trained with the Curtiss Training School in San Diego. Curtiss was the person who'd brought out this new pusher biplane. And that is the aircraft that Billy Stark brought to Vancouver. The first one was in the race course in Richmond. And those were the first flying exhibits in Canada. What was exciting was that after all these years of dreaming about flying, people couldn't believe when they actually saw somebody up there flying. And people used to come from miles to watch it.
Well, Billy Stark flew in the Okanagan once.
He was the first person to come to the interior, first any sort of aircraft. We bring an aircraft into the interior, and that was to Armstrong in Dominion Day 1912, that's July the 1st. And he was, the weather was a bit rough on him, and everybody was frightened to come in amongst the mountains. And of course, they're not all that bad around Armstrong, as you know. But nevertheless, this was considered extremely brave of him to come. And to compound the problems, when he got there was a howling wind blowing. And I gather from the description that the agricultural fairgrounds from which he flew had a big building at one end, and of course that was the downwind end, and he had to land into the wind. So he took off all right and got away nice and quickly in this heavy wind, went a few miles up the valley, which took him a long time, and then turned round and came whistling back over the top of them again at top speed. Apparently he was doing about 90 miles an hour, they estimated, when he came back, and those things flew at about 35, 40 miles an hour.
So it was a fast exhibition. How
That's
many
right.
people showed up for that show, do you figure?
Well, that's the interesting part of it. Armstrong was a tiny little agricultural community, and 5,000 people turned up. They'd obviously traveled very long distances just to see this
That'd be the
phenomenon.
entire population of the Okanagan Valley in
That's
19.
just about it. And it was difficult to get around then, too. It wasn't easy to travel.
And the show was one 90-mile-an-hour pass
That's
of a biplane going way over specs.
And then he had to land in a field beside it, and he had troubles with the aircraft, and he had to leave it out overnight, and the rain got to it. So in the end, they had to put it on a train and take it back to Vancouver. But it was the very first aviation exhibition flight, and those were big at the time because everybody was fascinated by really seeing somebody flying. Yeah.
Fast forward now, because I guess anecdotally it was barnstorming and, say, an individual pilot who showed off aviation in the valley for some time after that. But post-World War II, 3 guys come out of the service and decide to try and get an aviation business going in the Okanagan.
That's right.
Barney Bent, Alf Stringer, and Carl Agar.
Right.
Where do they meet?
They started off by being in the Air Force together. They were all Air Force officers. Barney Bent and Carl Agar were both flying instructors in the Commonwealth training scheme, and Alf Springer was the engineering officer. And that's where they met. And after the war, they decided they wanted to stay in flying, and they started a flying club. Didn't work because nobody had enough money then to afford to pay for their training. So then they tried to make it into general transport. Well, they had 2 Tiger Moths, and those are 2 cockpits. And of course, you know, your
much room for cargo.
payload with one, yeah, exactly, not much room for cargo. So that was obviously no good. And one morning, Carl Agar dropped into the post office and picked up mail, and they met in the coffee shop where a lot of business went on in aviation at those times, apparently, and they sat down and read an article about a company in Wenatchee, Washington, which was demonstrating a helicopter for agricultural spraying. And they thought, well, this might be an idea. They had quite a way to go from there because they had to find some money to buy it, and they thought the farmers, you know, the orchardists, would jump at the chance to having really good spray operations, but farmers are very conservative and the money didn't come. So they had a bit of luck. A group of people was Douglas Dewar, related to the Dewar family, but he was...
Dewar Scotch.
He was
Dewar
Scotch.
liquor. Oh, that's always
Yeah,
good for
he was
spray.
related it, yeah, and he was also a millionaire. He'd been a very successful stockbroker, I think it was, in New York, and he'd retired to the Okanagan, and he had put together the money, the funding, with Buckerfield, the seed man, was one of the people in it. I forget the names of the others. They put together enough to start a conventional airline, fixed-wing airline, and they had the license refused. It went to somebody else. So these people, Barney and company, decided, here's the money, we've got to persuade them to let us have it. And nobody would, none of Dewar wasn't very enthusiastic at all, but they finally talked him into it, and he provided the $50,000 they needed to buy the first helicopter. They needed that for, spares and training to be actually operational.
So they saw the helicopter in Wenatchee. Miracle of miracles, they get Dewar to finance it, and they take it off in the Okanagan. Big instant success?
No, not instant success, but the fact was an awful lot of people came to watch a helicopter because the same fascination. Now you'd got a machine that not only flew, but actually just hovered right where it was. And also, of course, the farmers were still skeptical about it, And they found the big snag was, although it was very successful, it was too darn successful. It could spray at the rate of about an acre a minute. No, it was 3 acres a minute, I think it was. Well, all the orchards in the Okanagan apparently are small, individual ones. They have a patch of apricots here and a patch of apples there, and they all need a different mix of insecticide. So, you know, it was useless. They would have to have a fleet of tankers changing things every 3 or 4 minutes, changing the mix. So that was no good. And then Carl flew into a wire and wrecked the machine. And that looked like the end, but apparently the company decided to try it once more, and they rented a machine that was available from Winnipeg that hadn't got any work, one of the other helicopters brought into Canada. And then from there, they started to buck up, because the following year was 1948, the year of the biggest flood in the Fraser Valley in that century. And that was it, of course.
A natural disaster made their fortune.
Yeah, because this was wide open fields, and they didn't have to do little patches at a time. They could fly way up the Fraser and back again and just put more insecticide in and keep going.
What were they spraying for there?
They were spraying against the mosquitoes. It was DDT.
Because all the mosquitoes that would be generated by the 48 flood...
All the sloughs left around, you know, the damp stuff, and so they sprayed it, and that worked.
I'm going to take a break there and come back, because after the flood of 48, which had some other effects too, they went on to even greater things. We'll come back and continue to tell the story of Carl Agar and Okanagan Helicopters right after this break. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts talking with Peter Corley Smith about the history of Okanagan Helicopters. Is it even called Okanagan Helicopters at this time? Now they're spraying mosquitoes?
Oh, they were called Okanagan Area Services until 1950, and then it became Okanagan Helicopters. Yeah.
So they're in the Fraser Valley spraying mosquitoes, which is better publicity than work.
Well, it was right along the highway, and, you know, the main highway, and lots of people could see them doing it. And at the same time, they got another job working on the Palisade Lake Dam up in North Van, which was a new dam for the water supply of Vancouver. And of course, that was even more visible. They hired another pilot called Paul Ostrander, and he flew the other helicopter, because they'd repaired the one that they broke the year before. Yeah. And they were up and down right over Vancouver, and people could see this thing really moving things, and it wasn't a toy anymore. It was a practical tool.
They were carrying concrete mixers and all of the gear.
Concrete mixers and all the gear and all the concrete and sand and everything up there. And of course, they were flying 12 hours a day in the summer, and it really made an impression on everybody. They got a working machine now. It wasn't a toy.
And this is at the very beginning of the technology of helicopters.
Right.
Igor Sikorsky, I mean, there was some in the Second World War, but it was...
Well, it was pretty close to the beginning, because Igor Sikorsky brought the first one that actually flew, you know, practically. And there was you could go so far back, 1938, there was a very effective helicopter in Germany, flown by a young woman, Hannah Rausch, inside an auditorium in Berlin. And it worked very well, but the Nazis decided to go for rockets and forget the helicopters. So, you know, you can go a long way back. But what happened next was they got another contract in the valley further on near Windermere in the East Kootenays. And that was very successful. They were spraying for the forests. And gradually, while they were doing that, they were working up the side of the mountain. And then Agar started realizing that he could fly a lot higher than the 4,000 feet that the makers had specified as the most they could go to, as long as you kept forward speed. So then he started to think, and he had a very brilliant analytical mind. And he thought, well, on the ground on a hot day, I have to jump this thing into the air and get it going quickly. What if I take that up and I land on the side of a cliff well above 4,000 feet, and then jump off and dive off the edge of the cliff? Well, it's easy.
What if I do that?
It's easy to sit here and talk about, but think of trying that for the first time. And he did, and it worked. He tried it at about 5,000 feet, and that's 1,000 feet higher than they were supposed to go, and it worked.
So when you're saying you would jump it off, you'd get the helicopter could sort of get off just by its ground effect, and then he would
That's it. When you were coming into land, you just cut your speed and cut your speed, and you got there just as you ran out of lift, if you were above 4,000 feet, and you landed. And when it came to takeoff, you wound full throttle, you had a hand throttle and a lever you pulled up, and you literally jumped it into the air, and at the same time moved the other control, which swung it over the edge. You dropped over the edge and dived down and picked up speed and flew away.
This must have had a heart-stopping effect on everybody concerned.
I don't think the passengers enjoyed it very much.
But it effectively made this machine usable to well above limits.
Up to 7,000 or 8,000 feet they started doing it. He started putting people down at 8,000 feet.
Now, you were flying helicopters at about this time, and this concept, were you aware of it? Did you read about it?
I was a little later, remember. I was about 5 years later. Everybody knew about it by then, of course, because that's the only way you could go in the mountains.
And even as a helicopter pilot, did you say, how did you feel when you
The first time I did it, I had a bad time because I was with a geologist, and he took about an hour chipping his stupid rocks, you know. And while he did it, I was just about shaking. When I did it, took a deep breath, and away I went, and down I went. And, you know, after the first 1 or 2 times, it was darned exhilarating. Just like a bird, you could go off down there. And, of course, it made it even more fun because it petrified the passenger ride. But it was easy once you got it, and, of course, it was great fun. It was a nice feeling. You really felt free. You felt like a bird.
So Agar is writing the book on the helicopter.
That's it.
As a matter of fact, he meets with Igor Sikorsky. And when I see this picture of him and Sikorsky, I think this is the height of a publicity shot if there ever was one, but it was a legitimate meeting between innovators.
Sikorsky was a great admirer of Carl Agar because, I mean, he did an awful lot for helicopters. Sikorsky was, you know, he was coming along well as a helicopter designer and builder, but he needed somebody like Carl Agar who brought it to everybody's attention. And in a moment or two, we'll get to, you know, when they got to the Alcan concept, and that brought it to world attention because there were articles in the newspapers all around the world about this wonderful project they were doing with helicopters.
So the time period from 48 to Alcan, Agar, Springer, and Bent are just, Stringer and Bent are just taking piecemeal jobs, but obviously becoming more and more in demand all the time.
They're becoming more and more in demand, and people started wanting them for military training for Korean War by 1950, because Korea, there were mountains there. They wanted their pilots trained in mountain flying techniques, so Carl was working his head off by 1950, training military pilots.
Out of where primarily? Because
they came from all over the place. He had requests from just about all around the world. They wanted to get their pilots trained for mountain flying.
He had this, well, he was a training officer in the Second World War,
That's right, yeah.
fixed wing, so he had that ability to put things into a logical lesson plan.
And he was also very analytical. He could work out what had happened when things went wrong and always seemed to know what had actually happened and could tell the pilot what not to do again.
And how did this trio of guys get along?
Well, they got on famously. I mean, you never hear a bad word about Carl Agar. I never have from anybody. They all thought he was a hero, and so did I. He was a wonderful guy. He was a lot of fun, too. You know, they had a lot of fun with him. They would have their parties when they came back from the bush, and they were fairly lively parties. And the sort of things they do would be to chain his back axle to a downspout and watch him drive away at the end of the party. In another case,
usually destructive results.
Yeah, in another case, the engineers, he brought in a mower that he'd just bought in the case with all the bits.
Mower, the gas mower.
Lawnmower, yeah, gas mower in a case with all the bits. And the engineers said, oh, well, we'll put that together for you. And they took it out and they cut about that much off the arms of the thing, then put it all together and wheeled it out to give to him. And of course, he came out and found he was down near the floor, and he went through the roof with rage.
Take a break. We're going to come back in a second because Camano, the creation of the project that powers Alcan, is the next word to talk about. We'll do that after this break. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with Peter Corley Smith talking about Okanagan helicopters. Camano. Camano was the power project that was to fuel Alcan.
Yeah, that's exactly it, and it was a huge project, the biggest one in the province up till then. I think it's still probably so. What had happened was Carl Agar was called up by a fellow called Wilfred Heslop, who was a professor of engineering at UBC, and he was asked to meet. Carl gave Heslop a demonstration of what he could do in the mountains around the North Shore, and he was asked to meet Agar. Was asked to meet him in Terrace about July, and he did, and they had Alcan had some gas put down at what was then Kitimat village, and they worked from there, and for 3 weeks they had perfect weather, which is very unusual in that country. And they did so well that in an article not long after, Heslop wrote in one of the, the major trade papers that it took them, did in 3 weeks what would take 3 years to do with any other system of transport.
That pretty much sealed the deal for Agar.
Not only that, it went around the world because this was a very prestigious professor and everybody knew about him. And he wasn't just making it up. It really was there, and it was something you could do with a helicopter.
What effect did having basically a limitless contract to work with Camano for the next 5 years do?
Oh, a tremendous effect, because one thing that they could start hiring lots of pilots, and they did, and engineers. For another thing, they had some capital. They could start buying more helicopters now. Alcan bought several, and Okanagan operated them. But it was a year-round operation. It was all the difference. They didn't have to worry about the helicopters sitting in the hangar all winter, not earning any money. And it just made a difference. And of course, from there, it really exploded. Everybody wanted Carl to teach them how to fly the mountains. And by then, he was teaching other people, and they were passing it on. And as I think I said in an article recently, I think they became the biggest helicopter operator in the world for about 3 years.
What happened to it all? What happened to Bent, Stringer, and Agar?
Oh, well, things fell apart in the end because once they became really successful, and the money men moved in, and they moved an accountant in to be president, and Agar was sort of shoveled aside and dropped out, and it was an absolute bombshell in the helicopter industry that the great Carl Agar had been dropped. And his health was failing a bit, to be candid, and he fell out, and then a year later, Alf Stringer left and married Lynn Henson, who was the widow of the founder of Vancouver Island Helicopters, and Alf went over and ran Vancouver Island Helicopters.
And Barney went on to his own...
Barney went on to his... Well, Barney stayed on the board of directors for many years after that, because when we started writing the book, we got his help, fortunately. Having somebody on the directors meant we could get into all the files and see what was going on.
Fascinating story. I mean, of innovative people from right here in the Okanagan who, well, wrote the book on what it meant to be helicopter industry.
It's nice to know that it happened here, isn't it?
It is.
Makes you feel proud.
Peter Cornelius-Smith, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been great.
Thank you.
Take a look at some of Peter's books, Pilots to Presidents, Helicopters, and many others. Thank you for being here on Okanagan Pioneers and Places. See you next time.